Welcome to edusati.com, your partner in education. The session is based on the discussion of para-completion. So, para-completion is a type of the question that checks your logical interpretation about a given paragraph as well as your verbal ability skills. So, it's a combination of your LR and verbal ability both. Right. So, what exactly happens in the para-completion question is that the question creator just takes a small passage from anywhere. So, it could be from a book or an article or a newspaper or anywhere, even a blog, and he removes one line from the paragraph. Generally, it is the last line that is removed. And then he gives you certain options that can be filled in the blank, no, the line that was moved, uh, and you need to interpret which among the given alternatives would certainly is the last line of the original paragraph. So therein you are tested on your understanding about the passage. The focus of the question creator is not to find the right answer but to make the incorrect answers, right? And this is how he frames the question. Now, he'll take any paragraph, he'll remove the last line, and he'll just modify that last line to a certain or the other extent and make 4 or 5 different options and present to you as a question. Now, it's up to you how you interpret the given passage and find out which of the 5 alternatives is the original line that completes the paragraph. This is a real tricky portion because if you understand if you've not understood the passage nicely, you'll not be able to answer it correctly. Reason being, the question creator will modify the passage last line based on the tone or little much of understanding. He might give you an example which is not being talked about in the passage, and you may think that there is a possibility that this is the concept is being discussed, so I'll just write the last line as an example. But it might be that there's an extension to the passage is not completed yet. Before giving the example, we've not even completed the passage discussion. So this is how you're tested upon, that are you able to judge the impulse of the writer. Now, one thing, be assured that you understand one basic fact. The question creator and the writer of this paragraph are two different people. So just the question creator has just taken one passage from anywhere which in this entire literary world, and he'll remove it, the last line of this passage. Now, even for him, this becomes difficult to analyze that how to make the incorrect option. So, what will he do is that he'll just violate a few rules related to the basic or generally accepted rules for writing any essay or paragraph. For example, he may start discussing a alternative topic which is more or less similar to something that's being discussed. So this would be one option that he's created. And you may think that because we are discussing something that is related, for example, he's discussing nuclear energy in this question, and he gives an alternative as solar energy. Now, you may tend to confuse that yes, we are discussing energy, but we are discussing nuclear energy. So, what the question paper setter has done is he's discussing in the last line, in an alternative, he's just started discussing the solar energy. And you may think that both of them are energies, so the answer is the solar energy. No, he's just violated one rule, which is that if we are discussing one point, it has to be continued in the entire passage. If you remember, while in the junior classes, when we wrote the essays, what did we do was that we introduced our topic in the first passage or the first paragraph, if it's an essay of any sort of that discusses any problem or anything. So the first paragraph was always the introduction, and the subsequent paragraphs were discussing the different aspects related to this topic. Uh, just that one aspect was discussed in an entire paragraph. So, supposingly, the second paragraph is discussing, let us say that the entire passage is discussing the different problems faced by women in the society. And the first paragraph is discussing verbal abuse that the women are facing. So this entire passage would only discuss the verbal abuse and nothing else. Right? If I have to discuss physical abuse that is practiced against women, that would follow in the next or any other paragraph. We cannot mix both these things in a single passage. Right? So this is what the question paper setter plays upon. He'll take this verbal abuse section, remove the last line, and to just confuse you as an alternative, he'll give you an option that discusses physical abuse as well. Right? And the another would be a modified version of the last line, that would be the verbal abuse thing, which would be a little camouflaged that you cannot directly relate to. And because you'll not understand this line, which would be a camouflaged version of verbal abuse, you'll remove this option as an thinking that is an incorrect option, and you'll mark the physical abuse answer as the correct one. But you have again committed an error. Here we are discussing verbal abuse, and you started discussing physical abuse in the last line of the passage, which is not feasible. You'll never directly start with a very new concept in the last line of a paragraph. You may start it in the middle, but you cannot start it in the last line. This is a very basic rule that was told to us while we used to write essays in our junior classes. So always remember, paragraph completion is an extension to the passage. So whatever the passage is discussing, you have to discuss the same thing in the last line as well. You cannot directly start discussing any other weird topic that is more or less similar. So you have to discuss the same but not the similar one. And next, try determining the dissimilarities between the paragraphs and the alternatives. That is what we have done. So what you will do is that you just judge that out of all these alternatives, which among all of them are not similar to the passage in any way. Say it to be the tense, say it to be the scope of discussion. By scope I mean like verbal abuse is being discussed, so we cannot directly start with physical abuse, right? Or it may be it might be anything like it is violating the scale. Like if the entire passage is talking about India, you cannot directly jump to US, or you cannot directly jump to the entire world, right? So it could be any way. So you have to just judge which among the given alternatives is the dissimilar ones, and the one that is not dissimilar would be your required answer. So let us discuss certain rules to identify the correct alternatives in the paragraph completion questions. Now, mind it, there is no set of defined rules to find the answers. Any question may be framed like, and it may have a very different perspective to answer. But these rules will help you to analyze the dissimilar alternatives, and you'll be a little comfortable in judging which is the correct answer. Mind it, these are not the set rules, and these are not the only 5 rules that we are discussing here. There might be other rules as well. So, whenever you have given a question, just check these 5 things in the alternatives, and if you find any dissimilarities in the basis of these 5 things, you are comfortable in judging the answer options. We'll discuss one on one, but we'll start with scope. By scope, I loosely mean the plot of writing the passage. Right? That what exactly are we discussing? Let us take the same similar example, wherein the passage was talking about the verbal abuse against women, and this is discussing verbal abuse against women. Right? And the last line is removed. Now, the scope of the passage is verbal abuse, and in one of the alternatives, it directly starts with physical abuse. So that is an incorrect alternative, right? But it is a very, very difficult rule to follow. I'll just say that do not directly start eliminating the options using the scope of the passage. You just think that, okay, I'll find out these options and I'll check the scope. No. Reason being, the structure of the sentence matters a lot. Now, for example, the entire passage was discussing verbal abuse, and one of the alternatives says, and on the similar lines, women are subject to physical abuse as well. I said that the entire passage is discussing the verbal abuse, and the line says, and on the similar lines, women are subject to physical abuse as well. Now, this line, although it introduces a new concept in the entire passage, which is physical abuse against women, but the structure of the sentence says that it is relating physical abuse to verbal abuse, and here it is not violating the scope. You have not started discussing physical abuse, you are just introducing physical abuse and you're relating it to verbal abuse, that they are more or less similar. Women are the way the women are subject to with verbal abuse, in the similar lines they are subject to physical abuse. Right? So it is not an incorrect alternative. Although the scope is violated, the scope of this paragraph is verbal abuse, but here it's introducing physical abuse. But the structure of the sentence has not violated the scope of the passage. Another alternative that is given to you might be that physical abuse uh, also leaves women shattered, right? So this is another option that's given to you. Now what happens is, this is the alternative that is violating the scope, because physical abuse has not been discussed in the entire passage yet. Right. So this structure of the sentence where you've just started discussing the impact of physical abuse would obviously violate the scope of the passage, but the sentence where you're just relating the physical abuse to verbal abuse is not violating the scope. So that is the reason we'll not take scope as a very strong alternative to choose the correct answer. It is a good rule, but do try to find out the dissimilarities based on the other rules that we'll discuss in this lecture further, right? So if you do not find any other alternative, like if you're confused between two, then take scope as the last resort and then check the scope of the passage. When you've eliminated the other options using the other rules, just try and you're just left with two of them, then you can check the scope. But scope is never the best method to find the answer. So scope is a very, very difficult rule that you will use or to identify the alternative. So you have better options like scale, theme, tone, continuity, etc. But then scope is also one of the rules that is important. Let's discuss the scale of the passage. Now the scale, we understand the relative size or the extent of something. We are discussing the impact of verbal abuse on the women in a certain organization. So, my organization becomes the scale. So, I am discussing it on a very micro level, microscopic level, right? But if I am discussing the impact of verbal abuse on the in India, so it becomes a macro level, because I have now included the women in India said to be, they said that they are working or they are not working, they are housewives, they are students, they are teachers, they are anything, right? So the scale now is macroscopic scale, right? So the scale, we mean the relative size of the subject, right? What happens is that, and one or the other alternative, the question setter usually he violates the scale. For example, the passage is talking about problems with women in an organization, and the option is discussing the problems in against women in India. So the scale is violated. Therein you were confined to an organization. Here you started discussing the entire women section in India. So the scale is violated. This is the way he has created an incorrect option, right? So uh, the best way is, when you're reading the entire passage, just judge that what is the scope or the scale of the subject. Whether is it confining to just a small portion or a small proportion, that is it microscopic or is it macroscopic? Let us discuss an example related to the same. Now, take a minute, just pause the video and take a minute to read the entire passage and try and fit in the most appropriate option that completes the given passage. Now, here if I look at the alternative number 1, that is alternative number A, it discusses the political situation of India. Alternative number C discusses the union legislations of all the states, or in short, India. Right? That is states and union legislation. But the entire passage is just focused on industrial regulations. Right? The entire passage discusses the legislations related to elections, mines, minerals, and industry, property, monopolies, coal, copper, general insurance, sick industries, etc. etc. It's just related to the legislations that are related to factories or industries, right? So it's discussing the industrial regulations and not the entire union legislation, because the union or state legislation not only includes industrial regulations but many other things apart from that. And the political situation of India, by that we mean the global politics that deals with India, or even the internal politics. It also has other certain issues which are not only related to industrial regulations. So here also we have violated the scale. Even here we have violated the scale. Both these options are rejected and we're just left with one alternative, which becomes alternative B. So my answer becomes point number B. Right. Another rule that we can discuss here is the continuity of the thought. Now, whatever is being discussed in this penultimate line, the line which after which the passage has been left blank, right? So that line, whatever is being discussed there, there might be a chance that the author is continuing that very thought further. For example, if there's a process being discussed in the second last line, so the last line will also discuss the process or its impacts, right? Or if he's giving his viewpoints related to one or the other problem or anything, the next part of the sentence would also discuss his viewpoints only. So what we mean is that you have to look if there is an incomplete thought or procedure left in the second last line. So the last line must complete this thought or procedure. And it's really very easy to locate these answers. Let us take an example. Now, again, you may pause the video, read the entire passage and try and fit in the most appropriate option that completes this paragraph. Now, if I read the penultimate line or the last line of the question, which is the penultimate line of the actual passage, it says, Palestinian youth in Gaza set hundreds of car tires aflame. Now, if something is set on fire, it will leave smoke, right? And that smoke will rise up. Why? Because obviously it is hot air and hot air rises up. As a result, the smoke will spread in the air, leaving the tops of the buildings and minarets and the mosques uncovered. Now, this is in continuation to the penultimate thought, that there were lot many car tires that were set aflame, that is they were burned, and since they were burned there was smoke and the smoke rose up, and the entire city was covered with a thick sheet of smoke. Right. So the point number D is basically continuing the process that was introduced in the penultimate line or the last line of the question. Thus, I'll mark my option number D as answer. Right. So it's a continuation of the thought. Right. Now you may get confused here that the answer is option number E. Why? Because we are discussing the death of someone. Afarat, right? Arafat, sorry. So you may think that we're discussing his death, so might be it's E, or the it might be BA, because all of them are discussing the same thing. They're continuing the like they're based on the tone, but the last line introduces an incomplete process, which is that the youth has set hundreds of car tires on flame, which and that is it. So the next line has to complete this process, which has led to a thick sheet of smoke. So my answer would be point number D. Right. Now, this is a very, very important rule to check the tone or the theme of the passage. Obviously, the author who has written the passage had some or the other basic essence behind writing this passage. If we understand his feelings or his attitude towards the subject upon which he's writing the passage, we'll be able to eliminate many options based on the uh, given in the questions, right? Because most of the times the question setter will play on this very fact. He'll violate the theme of the passage. If the theme of the passage is discussing that he's just describing uh, some or the other event. Now, for example, the question paper takes up a newspaper clipping as and takes and chooses it to be a question. The newspaper clipping is describing a function that was held in one of the schools of some city, and it is discussing 800 students took part, out of which 400 were women. There were two plays, three mono actings, eight different cultural dances, etc., etc., and the last line is missing. Now, if I read the entire passage, I'm just finding the objective information that's been given related to some event. He's just telling you the numbers and facts that were present. He's not giving any or the other alternative. But purposely, the question setter will set one alternative as the people were seen in flurry, or there was a sense of happiness or ebullience in the entire auditorium. Now, you, being the respondent, would obviously think that since it's a function that we are discussing in the passage, everybody would be happy, and thus my answer is this very alternative. But the tone of the passage is that it is very objective. He's just giving you the numbers. So you'll not select the alternative that violates the tone. And in this alternative, I have violated the tone. I'm now being judgmental. I'm now being analytical towards this situation. Right? So we have to be very, very vigilant while answering the question, that we are not to select an alternative that violates the tone of the passage. Right? So the most favorable option will always reflect the tone, the same tone that the passage reflects. Right? Let us take an example. Now, this question was asked in CAT 2006. Read the entire passage, again pause the video, and find out the most appropriate option that fits in the passage to complete it. Now, if I have read the passage nicely, I'll be able to analyze that the entire passage he's discussing, that how is he being confused as a very rigid person who's very stringent about his rules, and he'll impose his rule about upon others. And then he's justifying himself that he's not actually doing that, but he has some valid reason for saying the things which are taken or confused to be rules. So he first of all takes one example and then justifies it. So first of all, he gives some justification and then tells it how do people confuse it being a rule. For example, here in this line, he's giving you a valid reason that why did he ask the director this question, that do you want to really use a celebrity. So he just said this line because he knew that the research shows that celebrities are not very persuasive in making the people to buy a product. But the person who was directing the ad film, he thought that it is a rule, it's a rule that if I'm working with this guy who's actually talking to us in this paragraph, so he'll not allow you to use a celebrity, right? So the entire passage, we get an impulse of justification. So he's justifying himself or he's explaining himself. So I may say that the entire passage is either explanatory or justifiable, right? So the tone of the passage or the tone of the author, his purpose of writing is that he wants to justify himself, that whenever like he's asking something or he's uh, passing a statement which is taken as a rule, he has a very valid reason behind that question. And the last line of the paragraph ends in a explanation that he's like in the above here. He was also given a he first introduces an explanation, and then he tells that what exactly is taken to be a rule, that he's just asking a bare question, right? And then he's justifying himself, it is not a rule, right? So the entire passage he's justifying himself, and here he's just introduced another one such research thing or one such explanation to his logical argument, right? Now I'll read the alternatives. And eliminate the option number E because it is really vague. It is just giving you an insight of the passage, but it is not nowhere related to the passage. It's just telling you that the passage is talking about some celebrities or a type. So it's more or less like a summary, but it's not an extension to the passage, right? If I read options number A and D, they are facts. And the tone of these two is factual. But the tone of my passage is justification or explanatory. Since both of them mismatch, I'll remove these two alternatives as also. Right. Now I read option number B. Thus, all my so-called rules are rooted in applied research. Thus, are rooted. He is being judgmental here. He's saying you that how like people take him to be a very rigid person in the terms of his rules. And now he's also justifying, he's being he's saying that it is there's always a reason that I do it. So he's being more of like a judgmental person. So I'll remove this alternative as well. Why? Because here he's explaining and here he's being judgmental, right? So the only alternative left is the option number C. So my answer becomes option number C. Let's take another example. This was asked in CAT 2005. You may again pause the video and read the question, and then we'll discuss the answer. Now, if I have read the passage very correctly, I'll get to understand the entire passage has a very negative vibe. So the overall tone is a very negative tone. And the alternative numbers C and D are very positive. Why? Creation of experts. If we are creating experts, we are happy. Naturally, innovations are happy. Both of them violate the tone, right? Now I'm left with alternative A and B because I have removed alternative C and D from my option list because they are violating the tone, right? The result is disastrous. The result is mediocrity. Disaster again violates the tone because it is an extreme end, and we are not discussing the extremes of anything here. Since we are not discussing the extremes of anything here, it will also be removed from my alternative left, and I'll be just left with alternative B. Right? It violates the scale, whereas these two violate the tone. Because here we are getting extreme, which is the violation of the scale here. We are not talking about extremes, and here it is violating the tone. So all these three would be moved, and I'll just be left with option number B as a correct option. Right? So again, a very simple and logical justification led me to the correct answer to the question. Let's take another example. Now this is a very tricky question. It was asked in CAT in 2007. Just take a little much of time, pause the video again, read the entire question, and then try and find out the answer. Now, the question here, it starts discussing American public, which is not discussed in this passage. It is discussing American public schools. And just because it's an American public school does not mean that it will only house American public. Might be it's an American public school somewhere else. Right? So this violates the scale of the question. Right? Why? Because we're discussing the public schools and not the entire American public. So this is the entire American public, out of which this proportion is the school public. We're just talking about this public. We're not talking about this public, right? So American public violates the scale. So I'll eliminate this option. Right. Likewise, if I come to option number E. Now, parents should decide what should be taught to children. Neither are we talking about parents, nor are we talking about children. It goes beyond the passage. And since it's violating the scale again, I'll remove this option from my alternative list as well. I move to option number D, American government. Again, we are not talking about government anywhere in the passage. We are just talking about public schools, right? And how are they explaining the what all things are, like what is the basically illusion, right? So it is again violating the scale. I'll remove this alternative as well. Of alternative B, many schools that are in favor of teaching traditional and creationism of the to the students. Now, if I look onto the tone of this passage, the tone of the passage is speculative. That is, he's being speculative, that he's saying that on one hand there are people who are in the favor of teaching science like this, and the other are against it. That they say that the science classes are unconstitutional. So there is a speculation, there is a doubt, right? But the option number B violates this tone. It says that there are many schools that are in favor of teachers. So it becomes a very positive tone here, right? So since it becomes a positive tone, it violates the tone of the passage, and I'll remove this from my alternative as well. And I'll be left only with option number C, right? Now, one thing, if you look at it, it starts discussing American courts directly, right? Which violates the scope. Why? Because here we're discussing the Supreme Court, but it is correct in the terms of tone plus the scale, and a little much of the scope is violated, but however justifies this violation as well, because we are starting it with however, so there must be a contrast in the passage and the last line, right? And that is the reason the violation of scope is acceptable, but we cannot reject an alternative, accept an alternative which violates the tone or the scale, right? Scope is okay, right? So we will select alternative C as the correct answer to the question. As I said, we'll remove alternative A, C and D. Why? Because they are going beyond the scale. We are not discussing American public, we are not discussing parents, we are not discussing the American government, we are just discussing the schools. And alternative B is rejected because it violates the tone of the passage, wherein we are being speculative in the entire passage. That some people say that it is constitutional, and some say it is unconstitutional. We are not talking whether are they in the favor or not. So it violates the essence or the tone of the passage. So I'll remove even that alternative, and the answer that I'm left with is option number C as the correct answer. Certain times, a question paper setter may play with the tenses. Now, mind it, at such a big level of examination, such as CAT or MBA entrance or any bank examination or anything like that, you'll never be asked questions directly on tenses. But at such places, in the places of the paragraph completion or parajumpers, you might be tested on tenses. They won't give you a sentence and ask you what is the tense of this sentence, right? But they may check that do you understand that the tense must be homogeneous in the entire section, right? That is the why sometimes the question paper setter may give you some alternative that violate the tense of the passage, right? So you just need to check what is the tense used in the passage and what are the tenses used in the alternatives, and the tense that matches would be the correct option, or the tense which do not match would be removed from my alternative list, right? So just check the tenses and find whether they fit in the fit in as the perfect option or not. First of all, check whether the options are in present, past or future, and likewise check whether the passage is in past, present or future. Supposingly the passage is in present and some of the alternatives are in future, you will remove them directly. Furthermore, check whether is it a perfect tense or a continuous tense, or is it a simple tense, right? And then check the same for the alternatives, and the ones that violate would be removed, and the thing that you will be left would be the correct answer. Let's take an example. Pause the video, read the question, try and give the answer. Right? If I read the passage, I just come across that the entire passage is it is talking about something that happened in the past, right? If I read it like had gone, right? So the last line, the penultimate line is in the past. So I'll maintain this homogeneity. Nature has present, nature had past. Nature and humanity are present. One triumph of our united humanity has followed another present. Out of the four, three violate the tense, and the one that is left is my correct answer. Because only one alternative is homogeneous with the tense, I will select that as an alternative. The entire passage is in past. See, had, right? And yet come to think it is a logical consequence even, right? Although these things are in present, but these are the things that are universal truths. Now, if we have done the uh, class of tenses, we always say that the universal truths are stated in present tense, simple present tense. So, do not confuse yourself here. The last line of the passage is in past, the first lines are also in past, but the things that are written in between are stated in present. Why? Because they are universally accepted facts. So they ought to be written in the present tense, right? So if you understand this basic rule, you'll be able to answer it correctly. Since the last penultimate line is in past, that means the next line also has to be in the past tense. So my answer became option number B. Now these days we are tested on a very new type of the question, wherein the out of the entire passage, the last line, instead of the last line, one of the lines from in between is removed, and your task is now to find which of the given alternatives fits in that blank. The methodology remains the same. Just check that where is the homogeneity or the continuity of the thought maintained. Now, we'll take an example and try and interpret the answers. This is a question that was asked in CAT 1993. Again, pause the video and try and find the answer. Now, if I read the question nicely, I see that after the blank, we are discussing some of the other courses of actions. Right? And what should be done? What is happening now? How is it? How are the things changing? That means there must be some of the other problem that's being discussed in this plan. And secondly, if I read the first few lines, that is the first two lines of this passage, I'll come across that the passage is discussing about it's a very negative side. The tone is negative. It's telling you that the people are living into a life of ambiguity, or it's something hidden or camouflaged, right? So we must continue this very thought here, and both these things are more appropriately filled by the option number B, right? Because in this nuclear age, our mind has made the world more flawed or dangerous and even lethal. That is why some people are opening their eyes. So here is the problem that we are talking about. Because we had to fill some problem here, the problem must be filled, and out of all these four alternatives, only B is discussing that problem. So my answer would be alternative B. Right? So now we're going to discuss a very important method by which we can find the answers most appropriately. Right? What happens is that the question setter, because he has the access of the entire thing from which he's deriving one paragraph, what he does is to just confuse you, he gives you the four lines of the next paragraph as the question options, right? So because that will reduce his task, his burden of framing the question. And since both these passages are derived from the same source, they are more or less similar. They sound the same, and the person who's answering the question, he's confused the most. So what he does is, for example, he's picking paragraph number 2 as the question, and he's removing the last line from there. What will he do is that he'll take paragraph number 1 or paragraph number 3, break it into four parts, and present them you along with the correct option as the alternatives. And you, while reading, will obviously feel that, oh my god, what could be the sequence, because they all sound same. So very, very appropriate method of finding the answer is that you just treat the question, the alternatives, as a question of para jumbles, and apply the basic rules of para jumbles and find out what out of the given alternatives would be the first paragraph or the opening sentence of this parajumble. The opening sentence of this parajumble would be the required answer to your question. As I'm telling you, since uh, the options that are presented or the alternatives that are given are more or less similar, the opening sentence would obviously be that very sentence that would complete the question paragraph, right? Let's take an example, read this entire passage and try and find out the answers. Now, if I read the passage, I'll just be able to eliminate option number B as an incorrect alternative, just thinking that okay, since we're not talking about Japan here, so it violates the scale, so I'll not, so this cannot be my answer. But what next? What next? I mean, what should be the next? Like which other options should I remove? Right. So what I'll do is I'll treat the entire all these alternatives as a complete parajumble question and try and interpret what comes after what. Right. Uh, if and once I have done that, the sequence I'll get, the first sentence of that sequence would be my required answer. Right. I have just read, and the last line of this question introduces some black powder, and the entire other passage is discussing that black powder. So I'll now try and relate these things, and I'll frame a complete paragraph. Now, if I treat the alternatives A, C, D, and E as a question of parajumble, and I'll try and arrange them to form a coherent sequence of a paragraph. So, alternative C says additives in black powder, and alternative E says the basic formula for making the black powder. So, applying the basic rules of parajumbles, I know that the chronology has to be maintained. So, first of all, I'll make the black powder, so E, and then I'll add something that becomes C. So, E and C is a mandatory pair. Uh, then this line, and then nevertheless the appeal of the firework, this is an obvious end to the parajumble question, so it will end in D. And this heat splits the chemical bonds. Now till the time I have not discussed what are the chemical bonds, I'll not be able to tell which chemical bond, like which chemical, I'll not be able to split it by the heat. So EC will be followed by A, and the paragraph that I'll get would be ECAD. And out of this, E is my starting or opening sentence. So I'll mark that as my required answer. So I'll get my answer as alternative E. How? Because if I treat it as the parajumble question, E becomes my opening sentence. This question can also be done with various things, but that will take a lot of time. How? I had already removed option number B because it violated the scale. I'll remove option number A because it violates the scope. Now this again violates the tone because here I'm explaining the it's more of an explanatory or descriptive tone, and here it is an ebullient tone. Why? Because I'm saying that it appeals, or it is very it appeals, right? So lastly, I'm left with C and E. Out of C and E, again there would be a confusion. Which should be the correct alternative? Right? Then I'll check whether have I discussed the basic formula or not. So just for the sake of continuity, I'll connect the option number E, right? But this method will take a lot much of time. Why? Because you'll always get confused between C and E. And applying the parajumble approach, the answer was available within seconds. So this method will certainly help you a lot in your questions. Let's do some practice questions. Again, pause the video and try and find out the answer to the question. Now, if I read the entire passage, I'll remove alternative E because it violates the tone. The entire passage is talking about the positive aspects, whereas the option number E violates the tone as it starts discussing something negative. She lagged, right? So it discusses something negative. I'll remove option number D from my answer list. Why? Because it is saying that she was a good detective, which is okay, but a good woman, it violates the scale. I'm not discussing about her being a woman, so I'll remove this question as well, this alternative as well. She had an intelligent secretary too. It violates the scope. We are not discussing her secretary, we are just discussing her. Right. Then alternative A is removed. Why? Because it starts with a but and discusses something that is good. So after the but, there is something that is good. And if I'm writing a but, there must be a contrasting thing that precedes but, so there must be something that is bad. So my penultimate sentence must discuss a negative aspect of Ma'am Ramaswamy, which is not happening actually. The last line also is discussing her positive points, right? So it is telling something that is a quality of ma'am, ma'am Ramaswamy. And after the but also I'm continuing this thought. So this but violates the rule of itself, right? So even I'll remove this option and I'll be left with option number B. So my answer became option number B. Let's do another question. Again, pause the video, read the question, and then try and answer the question nicely. Now, if you've read the question nicely, I come across that it is discussing how, it is more of a critical or an analytical tone, wherein it is saying that it is bad that we're using animals for the benefit of humans for experimenting. So I remove this alternative. Why? Because it violates the tone, right? Herein, you being analytical, here you being judgmental. Since you're being judgmental in this alternative A, you'll remove this because it violates the tone. Right? Then, here, equating human rights with those of animals, it violates the scale. We're not discussing human rights. Right? So we are not discussing something, we'll not keep it in our view. So it violates the scale. Both of them are removed from my alternative list. Right. Now, if I read the last line, it says, "What if super intelligent beings of Alpha Centauri landed on Earth and decided to use us for their experiment, arguing that they could save far more of their and our lives by so doing?" So it says that something that is more mighty experiments on something which is a little lesser mighty than itself. So the Alpha Centauri is experimenting on humans. Why? Because it is more strong. Likewise, humans are experimenting on animals which are lesser strong. Right? So this is a sense, this is the continuity that's being maintained in this passage. And since I have to fill in something, I must maintain the continuity. So I'll select alternative B as my answer, because then it would be more or less continuous, right? And the answer would become option number B. Again, why? Because if the continuity says that we are experimenting on the animal, saying that we if we do not, then it will not be like, we'll how will we test whether or whether these things or these diseases, like, or these antidotes are helpful or not, right? Similarly, is it fair? Because what, like, Is it fair or not? Why? Because the explanation to this very question is given in the next line. The next line asks, what if a bigger or a mightier force comes or lands on Earth and starts experimenting on us? So the tone says that we are justifying by comparing ourselves to the animal. So the comparison is more or less done in the option number B. So my answer becomes option number B. Well, this gets us to the end of the discussion of para completions. This is a real tricky topic. Do practice it a lot. If you've got any doubts, redo this entire video and just practice a lot because that will help you. That gets us to the end. Thank you and have a nice day.